this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on emotion regulation concerned with the personality characteristics most related to coping as it pertains to distinctions in proactive coping and or solution seeking and or conflict resolution skills. Emotion regulation engages the executive function in relation to the HPA axis involving the hippocampus, amygdala, and or pituitary gland. Each are meaningful for engaging stress-related responses and or coping, and most meaningfully, the executive function is most meaningful to engage proactive coping and or solution seeking and or conflict resolution, engaging future-oriented conducts that are appropriate to solve underlying issues in relation to the satisfying of certain meaningful, relevant, and or appropriate underlying psychological needs within the problems. All the personality characteristics I have been philosophizing on should be related in some certain meaningful direction to satisfy certain underlying psychological needs connected to unique self-preferences. The personality characteristics would otherwise be irrelevant and or meaningless had they not been in some sort of relevant relationship to one's being connected to satisfy certain underlying needs with the appropriate self-preferences that are navigational of what's meaningful to build consistency and or strengthen certain conducts and or misconducts, be it that the underlying psychological need satisfactions are inappropriate, irrelevant, and or harmful to an individual's subjective well-being. What ultimately shapes and forms certain personality characteristics is underlying psychological need satisfactions that are calibrated to an individual's self-preferences. The most meaningful coping connects an individual to the needs within certain coping, to the solutions within problems, including conflict resolutions. As we engage communications, there are needs within the communication to solve certain problems that we need to conduct meaningfully to solve the problem within the conflict. Avoiding needs, instead focusing on wants, prevents and or harms and or is often more counterproductive to solving the conflict, engaging conflict resolution skills. Inferring another's unmet needs within the conflict is most meaningful to engage more proactive solutions to problems as one engages the executive function to evaluate the benefits one will provide the other in terms of whom is the benefactor had one appropriately satisfied the unmet underlying psychological needs within the conflict. And you often will hear this implicitly and or explicitly communicating with another whom holds some meaningful concern and or desire for certain conducts to be changed and or may hold certain prejudices, not to mean necessarily hateful, yet more meaningfully prejudgments into what they may experience threat and or desire relief in terms of feelings of satisfaction, most associated with certain needs for security in some cases, to not feel threatened, and or maybe one is concerned with not having certain underlying psychological needs met in a student-teacher relationship where a conflict may arise in terms of a student avoiding class for what the teacher had warned on several distinct occasions to the student would result in a more serious outcome in terms of one's final grade, avoiding the submission of certain rough work within smaller assignments that have built up to a bigger project that one needs to complete in order to satisfy certain underlying psychological needs that are resulting in the individual to experience psychological distress and or anxiety in terms of the consequences related to the avoidance of submitting the assignments, engaging more conflict, and in some cases missing class. Not necessarily in this case getting angry, be it in this case the student may desire to get a good grade, yet maybe not necessarily for desiring to do well in the particular course one is taking, yet may need the grade to do well in another course one is thinking is more meaningful for one's future career aspirations. This individual may be getting good grades in other classes, and yet this one class an individual may have more difficulty in, having missed one or two assignments, and yet has more difficulty in terms of the communications, feeling more embarrassed, and may have more difficulty communicating embarrassment, and or may also lack the self-knowledge and or self-awareness into what embarrassment exactly feels like, instead more thinking it to be anxiety and or threat related, instead of approaching embarrassment and or perhaps learning to not take oneself so seriously and laughing at oneself in terms of one's flubs. To be able to appropriately satisfy within clear communications what one needs to do with more vaguenesses and gaps in one's thinking, and or potentially resulting in abnormalities in executive functioning, as anxiety is related to how we process information related to the future and future-oriented perceptions of threat and or various issues in the future that are more likely to result in harm or injury. Not always threat, yet threat tends to be most related to anxiety. Engaging future-oriented aversions that one desires to avert from the more uncomfortable experiential encounters within a distinct direction. This means that in order to resolve the issue, the teacher should infer the unmet psychological needs that are resulting in the individual to engage avoidances. Perhaps confronting the individual and or asking more open-ended questions to explore the difficulties within the communication and to engage more perspective-taking skills to infer what may be resulting in the individual from failing to connect to their negative meaning and affect and calibrate the negative meaning of affect to negative meaningful emotions, to engage emotion-focused coping, to communicate clearly to them and or work more cooperatively to resolve the needs within the communication, resolving the conflict per se, not necessarily completing the assignment and or missed assignments, yet to clarify what the issues are so that there are no gaps in meaningful information into future-oriented communications, to engage more meaningful prosociality within communications, that one may more easier access and or evaluate knowledge in terms of the gaps in meaningful information with, in this case, the underlying need of the teacher to satisfy the need for knowledge and or need for cognition in order for the teacher to ultimately conduct their job more meaningfully and successfully. And this may be related to the underlying psychological need for meaning in life, be it the teacher wants to be the best teacher the teacher may be. Yet, this may not always be probabilistic, as the individual may be more aversive and or engage more maladaptive coping that will worsen their emotional regulation. Be it that they may have cultivated certain maladaptive coping skills that impact other areas of their life, engaging more aversions and building problems that may result in a full-blown generalized anxiety disorder with difficulties in terms of responding to stress-related stressors and or increasing the likelihood one will experience certain threats, with abnormalities in the executive function associated with deficits and or impairments and or harm with future-oriented planning. In some cases, perceiving more harm without the appropriate calibration of risk, to little benefit in terms of attempting to solve the problem and or may have not thought meaningfully about solving the problem, with more benefit in terms of one's evaluation one perceives, not necessarily that's actual, factual, and probabilistically likely to truly benefit the individual, and more likely is counterproductive, be it that the individual is experiencing negative, meaningful emotions that are harmful and or resulting in a generalized anxiety disorder and or post-traumatic stress disorder, be it that this is now impacting negatively an individual's memories and or learning to engage more appropriate proactive coping one should have conducted in terms of perceiving the solutions to allowance for meaningful solutions one experiences with the pangs of deprivation as one experiences the stress to alleviate one's suffering with the most appropriate and or relevant and or meaningful responses to prevent and or mitigate future-oriented depression and or anxiety and or panic, be it that an individual is experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, one is more likely to engage in the maladaptive coping strategy that's unique to panic. And panic is truly never a positive, meaningful coping strategy. So be it that you experience panic, you should take a step back, process the information, and consider whether or not your considerations for the stressor that you're perceiving is rational, and be it that it's irrational, you should take a deep breath, count to 3, and visualize in your mind a triangle with a line with each intersection from the line to one point to another, connecting 6 times each point to allowance for clarity. So you have the bottom of one line to the top of another, and the bottom of that next line that's intersecting with the top line to the bottom of another, and the bottom of the other line that's intersecting with the third line to the bottom of the first line that you were connecting, so that there's 3 points connecting 6 total points from each line that holds 2 points. As you're breathing in 3 seconds, and then breathing out another 3 seconds, and then breathing in another 3 seconds, so that you've breathed in 9 seconds in total. And this allowances for more meaningful clarity in terms of regulating your stress response, allowancing time and or effort amongst disallowancing what may in the panic be counterproductive, canceling the harmfulness within the panic to engage more proactive coping that is engaging more meaningful thought processes subsequent to the emotion-focused coping. So you can see how emotion-focused coping and proactive coping can often work more in combination, that provides more meaningful solution seeking as one may brainstorm within the evaluations of more rational, probabilistic solutions to problems from certain meaningful similarities one may have conducted in terms of uniquely the relevant and or meaningful information one holds. Be it that one is experientially encountering unknown unknowns, well, you may be in luck, as the likelihood you've experienced problems where you had not held the solution, you may have experientially encountered the certain experiences you tend to confront as you explore unknown unknowns with the need to engage solution seeking, and solution seeking that may engage more of a need for cognition to explore the locations you learn of solutions, be it that you hold no meaningful existing priors specific to the problem and or the solutions to the problem. You may hold meaningful similarities in terms of another meta problem associated with what happens in the case I lack the meaningful self-knowledge and or self-awareness domain specific to solving this problem. You may seek out an individual whom is more likely to hold self-knowledge and or self-awareness to solve the problem. This is a solution to the other problem that is related to the first problem that you may need to resolve the second problem to solve the first problem. And or you may have access to a smart device and or hold certain keywords to connect within your meaningful utterances of thought, certain key points to allowance for key questions you may Google. And this is often what individuals whom are in information technologies related works tend to conduct in terms of diagnosing various issues, be it one may have a busted projector, a projector that appears not to be working, yet there may not be any clear physical damage, and upon engaging the initial diagnostic, it would appear that it's more likely to be some issue with the software in terms of perhaps the laptop the projector is connected to, and or maybe be it that one is attempting to connect with Bluetooth, some sort of software on the device itself, not necessarily the projector, as the projector one may have been told was working previously, and where some individual was attempting to connect their laptop, and or the laptop was not previously paired to the projector. So this allows an individual to narrow down the probabilistic range of the most likely causations for the problem, that allowances for certain keywords to communicate key points, to engage solutions seeking for certain problems, to resolve the issue with the meta problem. What happens in the absence of self-knowledge and or self-awareness to solve the problem I am experiencing, current to future oriented within the momentariness of this encounter, experientially navigating more meaningful probabilistic solutions from what self-knowledge and or self-awareness relevant and or meaningful and appropriate one truly holds, not the self-knowledge and or self-awareness irrelevant, irrational, and or counterproductive, and or what's not in one's control, to build on what is in one's control. Individuals who may experience anxiety and or panic-related disorders tend to focus more on what's not in their control, placing more emphasis on what's not in their control, engaging more aversions as a result often of what's not in their control, compared to individuals whom are more psychologically resistant and or more emotionally intelligent, whom tend to build on what's in their control and or avoid appropriately what's not in their control, as what's not in their control is more likely to result in wastes of time and energy that exhaust an individual whom is trying meaninglessly, and are more likely to build negative self-talk, experiencing the helplessness of one's existentia as one attempts to engage what truly is meaningless, aimless, and or ultimately more likely to result in negative, meaningful emotions outside of an individual's control. Yet the emotions one experiences is totally within one's control, as one whom engages the navigational wisdom to engage more meaningful what one may do within one's control, away from what one may never do outside of one's control, is more likely to satisfy certain underlying psychological needs for competence and or individual autonomy. Within the issues, one engages proactive coping and or building other meaningful skills. In some cases, maybe solution seeking, as one may engage within what's in one's control, the navigations of one's self-knowledge and or self-awareness to brainstorm solutions within solution seeking. Brainstorming is not unique, however, to solution seeking, as brainstorming often is most meaningful to engage in conflict resolution, to investigate the complexities that are more likely to be the resultants of engaging another individual's subjectivity. That's the most difficult thing to solve. And so building meaningful conflict resolutions to appropriately identify the needs within complex communications, inferring compassionately, not necessarily empathetically. It's meaningful to infer what works, not necessarily always meaningful to empathize exactly with what may be counterproductive, negative, meaningful emotions that the other individual may, in some cases, be resentful and or harboring certain negative feely-wheelies inappropriate to the conflict resolution that will, in yourself, had you opted for imitating the feelings, would engage more counterproductive conflicts, engaging more conflict seeking in terms of empathizing exactly what the other feels, to experience one's pangs inappropriately instead of attempting to solve the underlying issues in relation to the unmet needs, as you perceive what may be a perspective that has more gaps and or missing information and or, in some cases, immaturity of the individual, that a more appropriate response needs one to be more compassionate in terms of seeking what works, not what's more counterproductive in terms of what another individual may, in some cases, be seeking to engage in petty gossip from the conflicts instead of the solutions. Meaning that one may, in some cases, engage pathological all or nothing thinking processes in order to employ maladaptive coping skills that are satisfying superficial needs one thinks one holds to be meaningful, in terms of what truly fails to satisfy more meaningfully the needs one may have originally have sought, in terms of exploring what's more likely to allowance for positive, meaningful emotions, connecting to one's needs for perhaps security, perhaps meaning in life, and or perhaps individual autonomy. In some cases, perhaps competence, to feel socially competent, and yet may in some cases desire to engage in conflict in order to feint appearing socially competent, to engage the finger waving and or blaming of another to be responsible for the conflict and or lacking the appropriate conflict resolutions, antagonizing all meaningful attempts to resolve the conflict in order to preserve one's sense of self, to feel socially competent, engaging what is counterproductive to building social competence, and or are more likely to be individuals whom are suffering from borderline personality disorder, whom engage more conflict seeking in terms of engaging more hostility and or social aggression in counterproductive communications that one may, to another, blame the individual who may be proactively attempting to solve certain issues and yet antagonizes them, going to another individual one had previously engaged the same maladaptive communications to attempt to solve the problem, and or then say it was really true the other person was responsible for the conflict that they had. to then go to the person that they had the conflict with and say, it was you, not I. And then from that conversation, go to a third other person and say, see, both those individuals lack emotional intelligence, and I am the emotional intelligent one, and you didn't believe me. And this is often what is counterproductive to building meaningful social competence, as each of those individuals most likely holds some self-knowledge and or self-awareness of that individual's social incompetence that is often the very rationale that explains the negative symptoms impairing an individual's learning and or memory and or ability to gauge the appropriate inferences into another individual's underlying psychological needs meaningful to engage prosociality and or altruism within conflict resolutions, with impairments and or deficits and or disabilities in conflict resolution skills that, on the opposite of conflict resolution, is conflict seeking. Low emotional intelligence is most related to individuals who tend to be suffering from borderline personality disorder and or other personality disorders, including narcissistic personality disorder, perfectionist personality disorder, and or psychopathic personality disorder, that are troublemaker personality characteristics underlying those disorders and or dysfunctions, with less meaningful proactive coping and are mostly less meaningful intrinsically conflict resolution skills, engaging more social aggression and or hostility, with more vaguenesses and or counterproductive communications that push one away from the unmet psychological needs they most likely have impairments and or deficits and or issues even identifying, holding the lack of self-knowledge and or self-awareness to think the needs less meaningful to one's wants, in the event that one should truly be excluding the wants to identify appropriately the unmet needs to satisfy what's most meaningful, as the wants one may think one wants are more likely clouded by what is truly experientially encountered uniquely within one's perception, to experience more positivities and or optimisms, yet ironically never be satisfied with those had one not satisfied one's underlying psychological needs, and or engage meaningful goal pursuits to satisfy the step-by-step incremental need to conducts to conductively approach the meaningful pursuit in one's future-oriented, desired pursuit of meaningfulness within one's existentia, experiencing instead meaninglessness and the need to communicate the nihilisms. No matter what you misconduct, you will surely experience the meaninglessnesses of existentia, harboring resentments that are counterproductive, fueling conflict seeking without desires to engage meaningful conflict resolutions, compared to the emotionally intelligent individual whom, asks for clarity within the communications one is uncertain of the other individual's unmet psychological needs and or what the individual means. As communication is difficult and or one may not always hear the other individual. There are a lot of barriers that may prevent communication from even being appropriately input and or output in terms of the calibrated response, needing the internalizations of the appropriate sets of meaningful information input into one's sensors that one ingests to process the complexities, to volitionally output the solutions in communication, inferring correctly, uniquely within the crystal clarity of communications. One asks for clarity to respond exactly to what one clarifies, providing the reframing of what one may have communicated to confirm with the verifications of the other, who may say, that's exactly what I had said and or what I mean, and or no, you're completely wrong. I no longer want to communicate with you. You have frustrated me. And I keep on repeating myself. And that may be okay, as in some cases, that may be the individual whom is always seeking conflicts, and you may need distance. And the best solutions to some conflicts for individuals whom constantly desire to antagonize is to distance yourself and leave them alone, as they have an unmet need to satisfy in terms of communicating with others, and they're bad at it. That's what constitutes the social incompetence. And if you just leave them alone, they'll suffer enough to need to apologize. Had each individual prevented that individual from engaging the maladaptive coping benefits to build the false confidence that is feeding their ego, they would experience what is more sure to result in one's experiential encounter with the wrongs one had been the whole time responsible for. As one truly may never be socially competent if each individual one attempts to communicate no longer wants to communicate with them. As each time they attempt to communicate and or solve a problem, the other individual antagonizes them. And had each individual within crystal clear communications communicated this, they should surely know at some point that they lack social competence, and be it that they may not hold the conscious self-knowledge and or self-awareness, they more likely will experientially encounter the resultants of decreased serotonin in terms of the social incompetence, that one experientially encounters depression and or anxiety and or the negative meaningful emotions that are related to certain unmet psychological needs, pangs that an individual needs to engage the appropriate emotional focused coping and or more meaningful proactive coping skills to build social competence. And be it that that individual is more willful in terms of their next experiential encounter, you may be more likely to make a breakthrough in terms of getting somewhere, that you may meaningfully communicate to the needs and or solve the problems with proactive coping within the conflict resolutions, as you're able to respond more meaningful to the individual whom is not in an antagonizing frame of mind, engaging instead a distinct perspective with the willingness to respond more meaningfully to satisfy certain underlying psychological needs appropriately, not inappropriately and or engaging counterproductive thinking. And this may be true in other situations in which you may be more heated and or experiencing what may be overwhelming for yourself, and or another individual may be more hostile within the unique situation and or overwhelmed in the situation that may not be appropriate to solve certain conflicts. And so you may need time to cool down and or come back to the conversation and or collaboratively work towards a solution within the cooperations that allowance for mutual benefits. In terms of identifying what the problems were and are within the communications uniquely meaningful to satisfy the needs within the conflict. Be it those needs are satisfied, the conflict is solved, allowancing for more meaningful, future-oriented prosociality within the relationship, and or within future-oriented conflicts, building your conflict resolution skills. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep on this episode.